Today I'm sewing and sharing this maxi length dress in a winter floral fabric. This is the Shay dress by Chalk and Notch. This dress features a lined bodice, princess seams, pintucks in the sleeves, multiple skirt tiers, and I've chosen view A with the back invisible zipper. This was my first time sewing pintucks, and I was surprised by how easy of a technique it was. I hope you sew along with me. Let's get started. Using your interfacing pattern pieces, apply the interfacing to your sleeve placket facings, the inner edges of your main fabric center back bodice, and the center edges of your main back skirt to your piece 1. Now we'll take those center back edges to the serger, or you can use a zigzag stitch to finish those edges. Doing this for the center back edges for both main tier 1 skirts, as well as those interfaced edges of your main back bodice pieces. Also apply interfacing to the wrong sides of your center back bodice lining pieces, your side front bodice lining pieces, your side back bodice lining pieces, and your center front bodice lining piece. Now starting with my main center front bodice piece, I'm going to attach the side front bodice pieces. Placing these pieces right sides together, then matching the notches to pin in place. And repeat for both side front bodice pieces. And then slowly and carefully sew these curved seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Press those seams open, using a tailor's ham if you have one. And then with right sides together, pin your side back bodice pieces to the center back bodice pieces, once again matching those notches. And then sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And press those seams open. And repeat all of these steps to construct your front and back lining pieces. Then place your front and back bodice main pieces right sides together, matching the shoulders and pin in place. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. And repeat for the shoulder seams of your bodice lining pieces. Here's the right side of my front and back bodice pieces opened out at the shoulder seams. I'm going to place the lining and the bodice pieces right sides together and pin around the neckline matching my shoulder seams. Then we're going to sew around the neckline from center back all the way around to the opposite center back, starting and stopping our stitching 2 inches away from the center back edge. And you can mark those starting and stopping points in your preferred method. Sew around with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and end of your stitches. Now we're going to trim the neckline within the area that we've sewn. So start and stop your trimming before the starting and stop point of your stitching, and trim that seam allowance by half. And also clip into your curves. Using sharp scissors and being careful not to clip into your stitching line. Now we're going to understitch the facing. We're going to open the facing away from the neckline and over its seam allowance. And then we're going to sew the facing to the seam allowance, starting and stopping our understitching 2 inches away from the previous start and stop points. It helps to press that seam allowance toward the lining before you begin, and then to understitch, you're going to be edge stitching close to that original stitching line. Now I'm going to place my front and back lining bodice pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. And then I'll do the same to pin the side seams for my front and back main pieces. Sew each of these separate side seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now that the side seams are sewn, we can turn the bodice right side out. And you can give those neckline edges a good press. Now for the bottom edges of your lining, you have two options. You can take those bottom edges and do a zigzag stitch or use your serger to finish from center back all the way across to center back. Alternatively, you can turn that bottom edge to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch and press all the way across. I'm going to be using my serger. Then I'm going to pin together the lining and the main fabric around the armholes all the way around. So with those fabrics wrong sides together, I'm going to sew around each armhole with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. On the side edges of your sleeve pattern piece, you have 4 sets of notches. Transfer these notches to your fabric. Then we're going to fold and press the sleeves wrong sides together along each set of notches. Now that I have each of those creases pressed in place, I'm going to refold the fabric wrong sides together. Sew each pressed crease this way from one end to the other with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press all of those pintucks downward and repeat for your opposite sleeve. At the bottom of your sleeve pattern piece, you have a slit marking, and you also have a slit marking on your sleeve placket piece. I've transferred those markings to my fabric, and now I'm going to cut along those lines. Now for the sleeve placket pieces, I'm going to draw a line 1/4 of an inch around the slit on both sides. Doing this for both sleeve placket pieces. Now we're going to take both of these pieces and sew around the outer curved edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now place your placket facing right sides together with the bottom of your sleeve right along that slit. And pin in place. Sew around the slit using the lines that you drew as your stitching guide. And do this for both sleeves. Then trim those seam allowances by about half. Then we can turn these facings to the wrong side of the sleeve. And give them a good press. Then we're also going to turn those outer edges of the placket all the way around to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, right along those stitching lines that we created earlier. And press in place all the way around, doing that for both sleeves. And then edge stitch around those tucked under edges all the way around the sleeve placket for both sleeve plackets. At the top of your sleeve, you have notches on either side of the top center notch. We're going to take these sleeves to the sewing machine, and using the longest stitch on your machine, leaving thread tails on both sides, you're going to sew from one outer notch to the other, doing this for the tops of both sleeves. I've just done one row of basting stitches about 1/4 of an inch away from the outer edge. Now I'm going to place each sleeve right sides together and pin the underarm seam. Doing this for both sleeves. Sew each seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish the seams, and press them toward the back of the sleeve. Now we can place the sleeve and the armhole right sides together, matching the underarm seams and the notches that indicate front and back. Then we can start pulling the gathering stitches on either side of the top of the sleeve to fit the rest of the top of the sleeve in place and then pin. Making sure that the gathers are distributed evenly. And repeat for both sleeves. Sew both of your sleeves in place with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish the seams, and press the seams toward the sleeves. Fold your sleeve tie in half right sides together and give that a press. Do this for all 4 tie pieces. Then for each piece, we're going to sew one long raw edge and one short edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance for all 4 ties. Trim the seam allowances and the corners, and then turn each tie right side out. And give each tie a good press. Press the bottom unnotched edges of your cuffs to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch. For both cuffs. On either side of your cuff, you have 2 notches. Place the raw open end of one of your ties, right sides together with the cuff between the notches, and pin in place. Doing this for both ties on both sides. And repeat for the other cuff. And then you can sew those ends of the ties in place. Now we're going to baste the bottom edges of each sleeve, from one slit opening all the way around to the other. Make sure to leave tails of threads on both sides so that you have threads to pull for gathering. I'm going to use the longest stitch on my machine, and I'm going to use about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, doing this for the bottoms of both sleeves. Now we're going to pin the raw unfolded edge of the cuff to the bottom of the sleeve. We're going to place the cuff and the bottom of the sleeves right sides together, starting at either end of the slit. And you're going to start pinning at the notch at the edge of your cuff. This will ensure that the cuff extends 3/8 of an inch beyond the slit. And pin in place. Doing that on both sides of the slit. Then pull the gathering stitches at the bottom of your sleeve so that the sleeve and the cuff fit together perfectly. Once it fits and the gathers are distributed evenly, pin in place. And repeat on the other side for your other cuff as well. Sew your cuffs in place with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and then press the seam toward the cuff. Then fold your cuff in half right sides together, making sure that that folded edge that we pressed earlier is still folded down, and pin those short edges of the cuff together. Doing this on both sides. And doing it for both cuffs. And then we're going to sew those short ends with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, sewing shut those short ends of the cuff as far as they're extending over the slit. Do that for both sides of the cuff for both cuffs. Then we can turn those cuffs right side out, poking out those bottom corners. Then take the edge of the cuff that we pressed to the wrong side and fold the cuff in half so that that fold covers the original stitching line. And pin it in place to conceal the stitching. And do that for both cuffs. Then we're going to top stitch the cuff just below the original stitching line, making sure that you're catching that folded edge as you sew from one open end all the way around to the other, doing this for both cuffs. And then you can tie those bows. Doing that for both sleeves. Place your front and back Tier 1 skirt pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. Sew the side seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish your seams, and press them toward the back. For the Tier 2 skirts, place the front and back right sides together and pin along the side seam, doing this on both sides. We're also going to be pinning both of the back pieces together. And then sew each of your 3 seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press them toward the back, making sure to also finish all of those seam edges. Just as we sewed the Tier 2 pieces together to create a tube, we're going to sew the 4 Tier 3 panels together to also create a tube. Place 2 of the panels right sides together along the side seam and pin in place. Then take one of the loose ends and place one of the edges of one of the other panels right sides together with this edge and pin in place. Then take this loose end and place your 4th and last panel right sides together with this edge and pin. Now there should only be 2 remaining loose edges. Place them together and pin. Now sew each of the 4 pinned seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish your seams, and press them. Now we're going to gather the top edges of each tier. Whenever I have panels like this, I like to gather each panel separately. I'm going to use the longest stitch on my machine and start from one seam all the way to the next, and then cut my threads, leaving thread tails. Then I'll start on the other side of the same seam, once again leaving thread tails, basting all the way along the edge until I get to the next seam, leaving thread tails, and do the same for the next 2 panels. Repeat for the top edges of the 3 panels of your Tier 2 skirt, as well as the top edges for each of the 3 panels of your Tier 1 skirt. Here is the bottom edge of my bodice. We're going to be attaching the Tier 1 skirt. Move your lining out of the way, and we'll be pinning that skirt piece to the main bodice only. Place the basted top edge of the skirt right sides together with the bottom of the bodice, and pin in place at the center back edges and the side seams. Also match each of the notches. Then pull each of your gathering stitches so that the skirt fits the bodice perfectly. Do this for each panel and pin in place. And then sew this tier in place from center back straight across to the opposite center back with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish your seam. Press the seam toward the bodice. Here is one of my center back seams, and we're going to start preparing to attach the zipper. You want the length of your invisible zipper to be at least 1 inch shorter than the distance from the top of the bodice to the end of Tier 1. Now you can open your zipper and take it to your iron, pressing those coils open from the bottom to the top for both zipper tapes. Now I'm going to open the bodice main and the lining apart from each other. Then I'm going to place the right side of my zipper tape right sides together with my right bodice. I'm going to match the edge of the zipper tape with the finished edge of the bodice, and I'm going to start pinning the zipper tape in place so that the top zipper stop is 1/2 inch below the raw edge of the bodice. And then continue pinning all the way down. Then using a zipper foot or an invisible zipper foot, start sewing close to those zipper teeth from the top to as far as your presser foot will allow you to get to the bottom of the zipper. Now that right side of the zipper is sewn in place, I'll close my zipper And I'll place this left side of the zipper tape right sides together with the left side of the bodice. Having the zipper closed will allow you to more accurately match up your waist seam and the top of your bodice. Once again, make sure that that top zipper stop is 1/2 inch below the top of the bodice, and align that waistline seam, and then continue pinning the full left zipper tape. Now I'll open up that zipper, and I'll sew that left zipper tape close to the zipper teeth just as I did on the right side. Now that both sides of the zipper tape are installed, you can close your zipper to make sure your alignment is correct. Then with right sides together, we can pin together the bottom of the Tier 1 skirt. Finish sewing that Tier 1 skirt from where the zipper stitches stopped with a 3/8 inch seam allowance down to the bottom of the skirt. Here are the center back edges of my lining pieces. We're going to trim both of these center back edges by 1/4 inch. Then I'll open up that zipper once again, and I'll place that newly cut raw edge of the lining right sides together with the bodice, aligning those outer edges and pin in place. And do the same on the other side. Now we'll sew the lining and the main fabric together with that zipper sandwiched in between, following your original zipper stitching line, doing this on both sides. And then close that zipper once again to make sure everything looks right on the outside and on the inside. Then we can open out that zipper once again and turn these bodices once again so that they're right sides together. Fold the seam allowance back at the top to face the bodice lining, right along that stitching line, and pin in place. And then continue pinning that top edge of the neckline. Then we're going to finish off this open edge of the neckline, starting from where the previous neckline stitching ended, all the way to that folded edge of the zipper tape. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and do the same on both sides. Now that that neckline is finished, you can trim those corners on both sides, and then turn the lining right side out, poking out those corners. Now I'll turn the bodice right side out so we can tack the lining to the waistline. If you chose to finish the raw edges of your lining, you can place that finished edge over the stitching line so that the finished edge extends beyond that stitching by 3/8 of an inch. And pin the lining and main together all the way around. If earlier you chose to press that bottom edge to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch, you can place that folded edge so that it just covers that stitching line and pin in place all the way around. Now with that pinned all the way around, I'm going to work from the right side of the garment, stitching in the ditch of that waistline seam all the way around, periodically checking underneath to make sure that I am catching the bottom edge of that lining. Now we're going to start attaching the second tier to the first tier. Place the top basted edge of Tier 2 with the bottom of Tier 1, right sides together. Match your center front, center back, and your side seams. Then start pulling your Tier 2 basting stitches so that everything fits from notch to notch. Spread out those gathers evenly and pin in place. And repeat all the way around. Now that that's pinned all the way around, you can join these two tiers with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then finish your seams. Now we can start attaching the third and final tier. I'm going to place that basted edge right sides together with the bottom of tier 2. Make sure that each of the 4 seams line up with the quarter notches marked on the bottom of tier 2. I'm going to start by pinning each of those 4 seams at those quarter notches. Then I'll start gathering each of the 4 tier 3 panels to fit from notch to notch all the way around and then pin in place. And once you have that tier pinned all the way around, sew in the same way as we did previously and then finish your seam. Now for the very bottom of the dress, the bottom of tier 3, I've gone ahead and pressed my hems. You're going to press the raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch and then 1/4 of an inch again, all the way around the bottom of the dress. Edge stitch close to that inner upper fold all the way around the bottom of the dress. And now your Shay dress is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out the rest of my video library for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.